Montana Territory, 1885. The first snow of winter had fallen on Christmas Eve, blanketing the small town of Pine Creek in a pristine white that softened the rough edges of the frontier. The snowfall had caught Colton Evers unaware, though by this point in his 25 years of life, he should have expected Montana's unpredictable weather. Standing on the porch of the mercantile, he tugged his worn leather gloves tighter and gazed across the quiet main street. "Another Christmas alone," he muttered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. 3 years running the Circle E ranch by himself had taught him self-reliance, but it had also hardened him to the possibility of anything beyond survival. The frontier demanded everything from a man. There was no room for softness, for connection. Not when each day was a battle against the elements, predators, and sometimes desperate men. Colton adjusted his hat and stepped down into the fresh snow. His boots left deep impressions as he made his way toward the saloon. Christmas cheer wasn't something he indulged in, but a whiskey would take the edge off the empty feeling that always seemed to grow stronger this time of year. The Circle E was finally turning a profit after the devastating winter of '82 had nearly wiped out his herd. His father had died that spring. Pneumonia, the doctor had said, leaving Colton alone to rebuild what 3 generations of Evers' men had built. He'd succeeded, but the cost had been steep. He'd become as weathered as the mountains despite his youth, his handsome features set in permanent caution, his blue eyes wary. A man needs nothing but his own 2 hands and a good horse, his father had told him countless times. Anything else is just a distraction that'll get you killed out here. Colton believed it. He'd seen too many men lose everything chasing dreams of family and comfort in a land that offered neither easily. Inside the saloon, a few regulars huddled around tables. Garlands of pine hung from the bar, a half-hearted nod to the holiday. Colton nodded to Sheriff Miller and made his way to the bar, ordering a whiskey. "Merry Christmas, Colton," the barkeep said, sliding the drink across the polished surface. "Same to you, Pete," he replied automatically, though the words felt hollow. Christmas was for families, for people with something to celebrate. Colton had his ranch and his health. That was celebration enough for a man on the frontier. He was lifting the glass to his lips when the saloon doors swung open, letting in a gust of cold air and the sound of commotion from the street. Pete craned his neck to see. "Well, I'll be," the barkeep murmured. Stage wasn't supposed to make it through until after Christmas with this weather. Colton turned, curiosity getting the better of him. The sound of hooves and wheels crunching through snow grew louder. No stagecoach had been expected, not with the mountain passes threatening to close with each snowfall. Who would risk the journey this close to Christmas? His whiskey forgotten, Colton moved to the window, wiping away the frost with his gloved hand. The coach was indeed making its way down the main street. The driver hunched against the cold, 2 passengers visible inside. One appeared to be an older gentleman, and beside him, Colton blinked, certain his eyes were playing tricks. Beside the man sat a young woman, her face framed by a fur-lined hood, her features delicate but determined. Even through the frosted glass, there was something about her that made him pause. "Crazy fools," Sheriff Miller commented, coming to stand beside Colton. "Risking the pass this time of year. Must be important business." Colton nodded absently, his eyes still fixed on the coach as it pulled to a stop in front of the hotel across the street. He watched as the driver climbed down and opened the door. The older gentleman emerged first, then turned to assist the young woman. She stepped down into the snow, and even from across the street, Colton could see she was not dressed for Montana winters. Her cloak, though fine, was too light for the bitter cold. Yet she stood tall, surveying the snow-covered town with what appeared to be wonder rather than dismay. When she turned slightly, the hood of her cloak fell back, revealing hair the color of golden wheat in summer, falling in loose waves to her shoulders. Something in Colton's chest tightened, a feeling so unfamiliar he almost mistook it for indigestion. "You know them?" Sheriff Miller asked, noticing Colton's fixed stare. "No," Colton replied, turning away from the window. Just surprised anyone would brave the pass now. He returned to the bar, finished his whiskey in one swallow, and decided it was time to head back to the ranch. The newcomers were none of his business. Pine Creek rarely saw visitors in winter, but when they did come, they rarely stayed long. The harsh reality of frontier life usually sent them scurrying back east within weeks. This girl with the golden hair would be no different. The frontier was no place for delicate things. Lucia Reynolds pulled her cloak tighter as she followed her uncle into the hotel lobby. At 22, she had finally convinced him to let her accompany him on his business trip west, though she suspected he'd only relented because her persistent cough had worried the family doctor. Fresh mountain air, the doctor had prescribed, though the journey had been far more arduous than Lucia had anticipated. Still, standing in the small frontier hotel with snow falling outside the windows, she felt more alive than she had in months of Philadelphia society gatherings. "It will only be a few days," her uncle assured her, signing the hotel register. "Just long enough to finalize the timber contract, then we'll head back before the worst of winter sets in." Lucia nodded, though secretly she wished they could stay longer. The raw beauty of the mountains had captivated her from the moment their coach had begun the precarious journey through the pass. This was a place where nothing was hidden behind social pretense or pretty wallpaper. Everything was exactly what it appeared to be. "Miss Reynolds, your room is ready," the hotel proprietor said, handing her a key. "I've had extra blankets brought up. The nights get mighty cold." "Thank you," she replied, offering a warm smile that caused the older man to blink in surprise. She suspected visitors, especially female ones, were rare in Pine Creek. In her room, Lucia unpacked her modest traveling trunk. She hadn't brought her finest dresses, knowing they would be impractical. But even her simplest gown felt ostentatious compared to the rough-hewn furnishings of the room. From her window, she could see the main street stretching through town. People were hurrying through the snow, finishing last-minute errands before Christmas Day. Across the street stood a saloon, and as she watched, a tall figure emerged from its doors. Even from a distance, there was something compelling about the man. He moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to physical work, his stride purposeful. Unlike the other men she'd glimpsed in town, most of whom wore heavy beards against the cold, this one was clean-shaven save for a light stubble that emphasized rather than hid the strong line of his jaw. He paused at the hitching post, untying a magnificent chestnut horse. As he swung into the saddle, he glanced up, his gaze seeming to find her window. Lucia stepped back instinctively, though she couldn't have been visible from the street. A strange feeling fluttered in her chest, not the breathlessness of her lingering cough, but something warmer, more insistent. She shook it off as she moved away from the window. She had not come west for romance. That was the last thing her family would approve of. She was here for her health, and to see something of the world beyond Philadelphia's carefully manicured gardens. Yet as she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats fading into the snowy afternoon, Lucia couldn't help but wonder who the solitary rider was, and where in this vast wilderness he called home. Christmas morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. Colton rose before first light, as he did every day, to tend to his stock. The barn was warm with the breath of animals, a contrast to the frozen world outside. "Merry Christmas to you all," he said to the horses and cattle, feeling slightly foolish for speaking aloud. But it was Christmas, and even a man who had convinced himself he needed nothing but his own 2 hands could acknowledge the day. After chores, he returned to his cabin and built up the fire. The place was sturdy but spare. His father had never seen the need for comforts, and Colton had never bothered to add them after he was gone. A table, chairs, a bed, and the essentials for cooking were all he needed. The only personal touch was a shelf of books, worn from repeated readings during the long winter nights. He considered riding into town later. Christmas dinner at the hotel was a tradition for those without families to cook for them, but the thought of making conversation with strangers held little appeal. Still, the alternative was eating alone in his cabin, and something about that prospect seemed especially bleak today. His decision was made for him when a sharp knock came at his door. Frowning, Colton grabbed his pistol from its place by the door before opening it. Few visitors came to the Circle E, especially in winter. Sheriff Miller stood on his porch, his breath visible in the cold air. "Miller? What brings you out here on Christmas morning?" The older man stamped his feet to shake off the snow. "Sorry to trouble you, Colton, but we've got a situation in town. That stagecoach that came in yesterday? The driver's taken ill, and the passengers are stranded until he recovers. The gentleman's some big timber investor from back east, and he needs to see some property north of here before the snow gets deeper." Colton leaned against the doorframe. "What's this got to do with me? You know these mountains better than anyone. And you've got the best horses in the county. On Christmas Day, Colton raised an eyebrow. Miller shrugged. He's offering good money, and said he'd make it worth your while. Seems real anxious to get this business done. Colton considered refusing. He had no desire to play tour guide to some Eastern businessman who probably didn't know the first thing about frontier timber operations. But the thought of the money that could go toward the new breeding stock he'd been saving for, was persuasive. Fine, he finally said. Tell him I'll be in town in an hour. As Miller rode away, Colton changed into his better shirt and brushed his hat clean. It was just business, he told himself. A simple guide job that would pad his savings. Yet as he saddled his horse, he couldn't help but wonder if the golden-haired woman would be accompanying the timber investor. Not that it mattered, he reminded himself sharply. She was just another visitor who would soon return to the comforts of the East, another reminder of all the things that had no place in his life on the frontier. Lucia was enjoying her breakfast in the hotel dining room when her uncle burst in, his face flushed with excitement. "I found a guide," he announced, taking a seat across from her. "The sheriff recommended him highly. Says he knows these mountains better than anyone. He'll be here within the hour." "On Christmas Day?" Lucia asked, surprised. "Surely he has his own celebrations to attend to." Her uncle waved a dismissive hand. "I've offered generous compensation. Besides, not everyone has family gatherings on the frontier." He paused, studying her. "How are you feeling today? The mountain air agreeing with you?" "I feel wonderful," she answered truthfully. Her cough had subsided since their arrival, and the crisp, clean air filled her lungs without the usual tightness. "I would very much like to accompany you to see the timber property." Her uncle frowned. "The journey might be strenuous, and in this cold. Please, Uncle Edward. I didn't come all this way to sit in a hotel room." The doctor specifically said fresh air and activity would be beneficial. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "Very well, but you'll bundle up properly. Your mother would never forgive me if anything happened to you." Lucia smiled, excitement building in her chest. She had never seen a virgin forest, never experienced the true wildness of the frontier. The thought of riding through snow-covered mountains made her pulse quicken with anticipation. An hour later, they waited in the hotel lobby. The door opened, bringing with it a blast of cold air and the tall figure Lucia had glimpsed from her window the previous day. Up close, he was even more striking, young, perhaps only a few years older than herself, with intense blue eyes set in a face that seemed too severe for someone of his age. His movements were economical, confident, as he removed his hat and nodded to her uncle. "Mr. Reynolds? I'm Colton Evers. Sheriff Miller said you needed a guide." "Yes, indeed. Thank you for coming on Christmas Day, Mr. Evers. This is my niece, Miss Lucia Reynolds." Those blue eyes turned to her, and Lucia felt a strange warmth rise to her cheeks despite the cold air still swirling from the open door. She extended her hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Evers." He hesitated before taking her hand, his touch brief but firm. "Miss Reynolds." His voice was deep, with a slight roughness that suggested he didn't use it often. "My niece will be accompanying us," her uncle continued. "I trust that won't be a problem." Something flickered across Colton's face, surprise, perhaps, or concern. The trail to the northern timber stands isn't easy, especially in winter. It might be safer for the lady to remain in town. "I assure you, Mr. Evers, I am quite capable of handling a difficult trail," Lucia said before her uncle could respond. "I've been riding since childhood, and I didn't travel all the way from Philadelphia to miss seeing the true wilderness." Colton's gaze lingered on her face for a moment, assessing. Then he nodded curtly. "We'll need to leave soon if we're to make it there and back by nightfall. Do you have proper riding clothes, Miss Reynolds?" "I brought my riding habit, yes." "Not a riding habit," he said, and there was no mistaking the hint of impatience in his tone. "Heavy trousers, sturdy boots, layers of wool. This isn't a pleasure ride through a park." Lucia blinked, taken aback by his directness. In Philadelphia, no gentleman would ever suggest a lady wear trousers, let alone speak to her so bluntly. "I'm afraid I don't possess such garments," she admitted. Colton turned to the hotel proprietor, who had been listening with interest. "Pete, does your wife still have those old clothes from when your boy was younger? The ones she was saving for your nephew?" Pete nodded. "I reckon she does. You thinking they might fit the young lady?" "Better than a riding habit in 2 feet of snow," Colton replied. He looked back at Lucia. If you're determined to come along, Miss Reynolds, you'll need to dress for survival, not society. For a moment, Lucia considered being offended by his presumptuous tone, but there was no condescension in his manner, only a pragmatic concern that she recognized as genuine. In this environment, impractical clothing could indeed be dangerous. I would be grateful for the loan, she said. And I assure you, Mr. Evers, I value survival over social convention, particularly in these circumstances. For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Good. That attitude will serve you better out here than any fancy Eastern education. He turned to her uncle. I'll arrange for horses while the lady changes. We'll leave in 30 minutes. As he strode back out into the snow, Lucia found herself watching the straight line of his shoulders, the confident set of his head. He was unlike any man she had ever met in Philadelphia, direct to the point of bluntness, utterly uninterested in social niceties, and completely at home in this harsh landscape. Her uncle leaned close. A bit rough around the edges, that one, but the sheriff assures me he's the best guide in the territory. Try not to be put off by his manner. These frontier types aren't accustomed to polite society. I'm not put off, Lucia replied, surprised to find it was true. On the contrary, I find his honesty refreshing. And she did. There was something compelling about a man who spoke his mind without artifice, who clearly knew this wild country intimately and respected its power. As Pete's wife led her upstairs to find the promised clothes, Lucia found herself looking forward to the day's journey with an eagerness that had nothing to do with timber stands and everything to do with the stern-faced guide who had assessed her with those penetrating blue eyes. Colton led the small party through the snow-laden forest, the horses picking their way carefully along the trail. Behind him rode Edward Reynolds, bundled in the finest winter gear money could buy, and behind him, Lucia. He'd been surprised when she'd emerged from the hotel in the borrowed boy's clothes. Instead of looking awkward or embarrassed, she'd carried herself with the same quiet dignity she'd shown in her proper Eastern attire. The heavy coat and trousers, cinched with a belt to accommodate her smaller frame, did little to disguise her femininity, but they would keep her warm, and that was what mattered on the frontier. Now, as they climbed higher into the foothills, Colton found himself glancing back more often than necessary, ostensibly to check that she was managing the trail, but in truth, drawn by something he couldn't name. She rode well, he had to admit. Not with the stiff formality he'd expected from an Eastern lady, but with a natural ease that suggested she truly had spent considerable time in the saddle. Her golden hair was tucked beneath a borrowed woolen cap, her cheeks flushed with cold and exertion, yet she showed no signs of complaint. How much further, Mr. Evers? Reynolds called, breaking the silence that had fallen over the group. Another hour, Colton replied. We're making good time, despite the snow. As they rounded a bend in the trail, the trees thinned, offering a spectacular view of the valley below. Pine Creek was visible as a cluster of buildings beside the ribbon of the frozen creek, surrounded by vast stretches of untouched wilderness extending to the distant mountains. Oh! The soft exclamation came from Lucia, and Colton turned to see her pull her horse to a halt, her eyes wide as she took in the panorama. It's magnificent, she breathed, and there was such genuine wonder in her voice that Colton found himself seeing the familiar landscape through new eyes. This is why I came west, she continued, speaking more to herself than to the men. To see something real, something untamed by human hands. Not for long, her uncle commented, gesturing toward the distant forest. Progress is coming, even to these remote areas. The timber from these forests will build the next generation of American cities. Something in Colton bristled at the man's tone, the casual certainty that progress meant conquest, that the wilderness was merely a resource to be exploited. He'd heard it before from other businessmen who came through, seeing dollar signs where he saw beauty and balance. But it wasn't his place to comment. He was being paid to guide, not to share opinions. We should keep moving, he said instead. Daylight's precious this time of year. As they continued along the trail, Lucia urged her horse forward until she was riding alongside him. For several minutes, she was silent, and Colton found himself uncharacteristically anxious to hear what she might say. Have you lived here long, Mr. Evers? She finally asked. All my life, he replied. My grandfather settled this territory before Montana was even a territory. So the ranch is your family's legacy. He glanced at her, surprised by her perception. Yes. Circle E Ranch, about 5 miles southwest of town. And you run it alone now? There was no pity in her voice, just curiosity. Yes. He didn't elaborate on the circumstances. How his mother had died of fever when he was 12, how his father had worked himself to death trying to keep the ranch going, how Colton had nearly lost everything in that terrible winter before clawing his way back to solvency. That must be difficult, she said quietly. It's the way of things out here, he replied, the familiar words coming automatically. A man relies on himself. And yet, she observed, when we stopped in town this morning, I noticed how everyone greeted you. Sheriff Miller clearly respects you. The hotel proprietor and his wife were eager to help when you asked. It seems to me that even on the frontier, people need each other. Colton frowned slightly. Her observation was uncomfortably perceptive, challenging the solitary philosophy he'd adopted after his father's death. It was true that the townsfolk had rallied around him during his hardest times, offering credit at the mercantile, helping with emergency repairs after a storm damaged his barn. Neighborliness is different from dependence, he finally said. Out here, a man who can't stand on his own doesn't survive long. Perhaps, she conceded. But is survival alone enough? Before he could formulate a response, her uncle called from behind, asking a question about the property boundaries, and the moment was lost. Colton answered Reynolds' questions mechanically, but Lucia's words echoed in his mind. Is survival alone enough? It had been, he'd always believed. Survival was victory on the frontier. Anything beyond that, comfort, companionship, love, was a luxury few could afford, and a vulnerability no one should risk. Yet as they continued toward the timber stand, Colton found himself watching the graceful set of Lucia's shoulders as she rode ahead of him, the way she paused occasionally to admire a snow-laden pine or a distant mountain peak. There was something about her appreciation of the beauty around them that stirred a long-dormant part of him, the part that had once looked at the mountains with wonder rather than wary respect. By the time they reached the timber property, Colton had reluctantly admitted to himself that Lucia Reynolds was unlike any Eastern visitor he'd encountered before. Her questions were thoughtful, her observations keen, and her resilience in the face of the difficult journey impressive. None of which changed the fundamental truth, he reminded himself sternly. She was a visitor who would soon return east. A woman accustomed to comfort and civilization, who might find the wilderness novel for a brief adventure, but could never truly belong here. Just as he could never belong in her world. The timber stand was everything her uncle had hoped for, vast, untouched, and accessible enough for logging operations. As he conferred with Colton about the potential for river drives and mill locations, Lucia wandered a short distance away, drawn to a small clearing where the snow lay pristine beneath a canopy of towering pines. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional soft thump of snow falling from branches. Lucia tilted her head back, gazing up at the trees that seemed to touch the sky. In Philadelphia, nature was something tamed and arranged for human pleasure. Park gardens with neat paths, carefully pruned trees lining avenues, flowers bred for show rather than survival. Here, nature existed on its own terms, indifferent to human presence. There was something both humbling and exhilarating about that realization. A soft sound made her turn. Colton stood at the edge of the clearing, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Your uncle is making notes, he said. He asked me to check on you. It's so quiet, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking normally would somehow shatter the peace. I've never experienced silence like this. He moved closer, his boots crunching softly in the snow. Most Easterners find it unnerving. I find it perfect. She smiled at him. Thank you for bringing us here today, Mr. Evers. I know it's Christmas, and you surely had other plans. Something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of some emotion she couldn't name. No plans, he said simply. Just another day on the ranch. No celebration at all? She asked, surprised. Even on the frontier, surely Christmas held some meaning. Christmas is for families, he replied, his tone matter of fact. I haven't bothered with it since my father passed. The casual admission of his solitude touched Lucia deeply. In Philadelphia, her family home would be filled with relatives, servants, and the sense of a holiday feast. Christmas had always been a time of warmth and togetherness, She couldn't imagine facing it entirely alone. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "That must be difficult." His shoulders lifted in a slight shrug. "It's just a day." But there was something in the way he said it that suggested otherwise, a hint of loneliness quickly suppressed. Lucia found herself wanting to reach out, to bridge the careful distance he maintained. Before she could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the forest, followed immediately by a rumble that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Colton's expression changed instantly from guarded to alarmed. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward him. "Avalanche," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to move. Now." The rumbling grew louder, and Lucia looked up to see a cascade of white thundering down a slope some distance away. Colton's grip tightened as he pulled her back toward where they'd left the horses, his movements swift and decisive. Her uncle was already mounting his horse, his face pale with fear. "Lucia, quickly." But as they reached the horses, Colton suddenly stopped, his head tilting as he listened intently. "The slide's path is between us and town," he said grimly. "We can't go back the way we came. It's too dangerous. The trail might be gone, or another slide could follow." "What do we do?" Edward Reynolds demanded, his voice rising with panic. Colton's expression was calm, though his eyes were alert with calculation. "There's a line cabin about 3 miles east of here, a shelter for ranch hands caught in bad weather. We can reach it before dark and wait until it's safe to return to town." "But it's Christmas," Reynolds protested. "Surely we can find another way back?" "Not safely," Colton replied, his tone brooking no argument. "The cabin is stocked with supplies. We'll be comfortable enough for a night." Lucia could see her uncle wavering between fear of the avalanche and reluctance to spend Christmas night in a rustic cabin. For her part, she felt a strange flutter of anticipation rather than dread at the prospect. "Uncle Edward," she said firmly, "Mr. Evers knows this land. If he says the cabin is our safest option, then that's where we should go." Her uncle sighed but nodded, and soon they were heading east, away from the path of the avalanche. Colton led them along a ridge, the horses picking their way carefully through deepening snow. Lucia could feel the cold more intensely now, seeping through her borrowed clothes as the afternoon waned. "There," Colton finally said, pointing to a small structure nestled among the pines. "The line cabin." It was a simple log building, sturdy but modest, with a stone chimney and a small covered porch. As they dismounted, Lucia could see that despite its isolation, the cabin was well maintained. "I'll tend to the horses," Colton said, taking their reins. "There's a lean-to around back. Mr. Reynolds, if you could clear the snow from the porch while I get a fire started inside." Her uncle looked as though he might object to being assigned manual labor, but the cold and fatigue of the journey had taken their toll, and he simply nodded, brushing snow from the cabin steps with his gloved hands. Lucia followed Colton to the lean-to, where he efficiently unsaddled the horses and hung the tack on wooden pegs. There was something mesmerizing about watching him work, his movements economical, his focus complete. This was a man who had learned to survive in an unforgiving land, who took nothing for granted and wasted no effort. "Can I help?" she asked. He glanced at her, seeming surprised by the offer. "You could fill the water trough with snow. The horses will be thirsty." She nodded and set to work scooping snow into the wooden trough. The physical activity warmed her, and she found herself oddly content despite the circumstances. There was something honest about this work, something real in a way that her life in Philadelphia often wasn't. "You adapt well," Colton observed, breaking the silence. "Most Eastern ladies would be in tears by now." Lucia smiled at that. "I've never been particularly good at being a proper Eastern lady. My mother despairs of me ever making a suitable match because I speak my mind too freely and prefer books to needlepoint." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Out here, those might be considered virtues rather than flaws." Their eyes met for a moment, and Lucia felt a warmth that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Then he looked away, returning to his task of securing the horses for the night. Inside the cabin, Colton efficiently started a fire in the stone fireplace. The interior was simple but clean: a table and chairs, shelves stocked with preserved food, a narrow bed in one corner, and a stack of blankets and furs folded neatly on a trunk. "It's not what you're accustomed to," he said, addressing both Lucia and her uncle, "but it will keep us alive through the night." "It's perfectly adequate," Lucia assured him, removing her borrowed cap and running a hand through her tangled golden hair. And certainly better than being caught in an avalanche. Her uncle looked less convinced, but settled into one of the chairs with a resigned sigh. I suppose we'll make the best of it. A Christmas to remember, at the very least. As Colton moved about the cabin, heating water and taking inventory of supplies, Lucia watched him surreptitiously. In this environment, his environment, he moved with a confidence and grace that was compelling. There was no artifice to Colton Evers, no performance for the benefit of others. He simply was who he was, a man shaped by the land he inhabited. There's coffee, he announced, setting 3 tin cups on the table. And beans, salt pork, and hardtack. Not much of a Christmas feast, but it will fill the belly. It sounds wonderful, Lucia said sincerely. And if I might say, Mr. Evers, your hospitality in these unexpected circumstances is much appreciated. He looked almost embarrassed by her gratitude. It's just survival, Miss Reynolds. Nothing more. But as the evening progressed, it became clear that Colton was offering more than mere survival. He cooked a surprisingly tasty meal from the simple provisions, added pine boughs to the fire to create a pleasant aroma, and even produced a small flask of whiskey that he offered to Edward after dinner. To ward off the cold, he explained. Her uncle accepted gratefully, taking a generous swallow before passing it back. Colton hesitated, then offered the flask to Lucia as well. I understand if you'd rather not, he said. It's not proper, but propriety seems rather irrelevant under the circumstances, she replied, taking the flask and sipping cautiously. The whiskey burned pleasantly down her throat, warming her from within. As darkness fell completely, the cabin grew cozy with firelight. Edward, exhausted from the day's events and lulled by the whiskey, soon dozed in his chair. Lucia sat on a fur near the hearth, while Colton stood by the window, peering out at the night. Will the avalanche danger be passed by morning? She asked softly. He turned from the window. Should be. The slope will have stabilized overnight. We can head back to town after sunrise. And what would you be doing now, if you weren't stranded here with us? She asked, genuinely curious about how this solitary man would have spent his Christmas. Colton seemed taken aback by the question. He moved to the fire, adding another log before answering. Reading, maybe, he finally said. I have some books at the ranch. Or just tending to chores. Christmas doesn't mean much when you're alone. The simple honesty of his response tugged at Lucia's heart. She thought of her own family's elaborate celebrations, the decorations, the feasts, the carolers, and gifts, and how she had sometimes found them overwhelming. Yet the thought of Christmas passing unacknowledged, just another day of solitary work, seemed profoundly sad. It doesn't have to be elaborate to have meaning, she said. Even here, now, there's a certain peace. The fire, shelter from the storm, company. He looked at her for a long moment, the firelight casting shadows across his features. You find peace in strange circumstances, Miss Reynolds. Lucia, she said impulsively. Please, call me Lucia. After surviving an avalanche and sharing Christmas dinner in a line cabin, I think we've moved beyond formalities. A slight smile touched his lips. Lucia, then. The way he said her name, softly, as if testing the feel of it, sent an unexpected shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. And I should call you Colton, she continued, wanting to hear him speak again. He nodded, settling onto the hearth opposite her. Not many people do. It's usually just Evers around these parts. Well, I'm not from these parts, she reminded him with a smile. And I prefer Colton. For a time, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire. Her uncle's soft snoring provided a steady counterpoint to the occasional crack of burning wood. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling around the eaves of the cabin, making their shelter seem all the more precious. May I ask you something? Lucia finally said. You can ask, he replied, a hint of wariness returning to his expression. Why do you choose to be alone? I understand that running a ranch is solitary work, but you speak as though isolation is a philosophy rather than a circumstance. Colton was quiet for so long that Lucia thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he were speaking to himself rather than to her. My father believed that on the frontier, attachment was a weakness. He watched my mother die, watched friends lose everything to drought or disease or Indian raids. He taught me that a man survives by depending only on himself. He paused, poking at the fire with a stick. And then he died anyway, leaving me to save the ranch alone. I'm so sorry, Lucia said softly. He shrugged. It was years ago, but he was right about one thing. The frontier takes more than it gives. People who come out here looking for something usually end up losing what they already had. Is that what you believe? That loss is inevitable? I believe in seeing things as they are, he replied. Not as I wish them to be. Lucia considered his words carefully. But isn't that a kind of surrender? Accepting loneliness as the price of survival? Colton's blue eyes met hers, intense in the firelight. You speak very freely for someone who's spent less than 2 days on the frontier. Perhaps that gives me a clarity you've lost, she suggested gently. I see a man who has built walls so high he can no longer remember why he needed them in the first place. For a moment, something vulnerable flickered across his face, a glimpse of the young man beneath the weathered exterior. Then it was gone, replaced by the careful neutrality she was beginning to recognize as his defense. You should get some rest, he said, standing abruptly. Take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire, and your uncle seems comfortable enough in that chair. Lucia knew she had pushed too far, too quickly. This man's solitude was not merely a habit, but a carefully constructed fortress, and she had just attempted to scale its walls without invitation. Thank you, she said simply, rising to her feet. And thank you again for keeping us safe today. As she settled onto the narrow bed, pulling furs and blankets around her against the chill, Lucia found herself watching Colton as he banked the fire for the night. There was something about him that called to her, not just his undeniable physical appeal, but the glimpses of depth beneath his stoic exterior. The man who maintained this cabin for others' safety, who knew exactly how to survive in this harsh land, who had philosophical debates by firelight, but retreated when the conversation became too personal. Sleep came slowly, her mind filled with thoughts of blue eyes and the quiet strength of a man who had convinced himself he needed no one. As she drifted off, lulled by the crackling fire and the distant howl of the wind, Lucia wondered what it would take to show Colton Evers that survival alone was not enough, that life could offer so much more, even on the frontier. And she wondered, with her last conscious thought, why it suddenly seemed so important that she be the one to show him. Dawn broke clear and cold over the mountains. Colton had risen before first light, stoking the fire and preparing coffee, his movements quiet so as not to disturb his guests. Edward Reynolds still slept in the chair, but the narrow bed was empty, the blankets neatly folded. A soft sound from outside drew his attention. Opening the cabin door, he found Lucia standing on the porch, wrapped in one of the cabin's fur robes, watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. You're up early, he said, joining her. She turned, a smile lighting her features. I couldn't miss this, she replied, gesturing toward the panorama before them. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. The morning light caught in her golden hair, creating a halo effect that made Colton's breath catch unexpectedly. With her cheeks flushed from the cold, and her eyes bright with appreciation for the wilderness around them, she looked like she belonged here, despite her Eastern upbringing. The thought was unsettling. Coffee's ready, he said, retreating to safer ground. We should head back to town as soon as your uncle is awake. The trail should be clear now. She nodded, but made no move to go inside. May I ask you something, Colton? Here it was again, her directness, her willingness to push past the boundaries he maintained with everyone else. What is it? Do you ever think of leaving? Going somewhere where life might be easier? The question surprised him. No, he answered honestly. This land is in my blood. The ranch is all I have, all I need. All you allow yourself to need, she corrected gently. Before he could formulate a response, the cabin door opened behind them, and Edward Reynolds emerged, looking rumpled but rested. Good morning, he said, stretching. I must say, I slept better than expected in that chair. Is that coffee I smell? The moment broken, they returned inside for a simple breakfast before preparing to depart. As they saddled the horses, Colton found himself watching Lucia more closely than necessary. She moved with a natural grace, adapting to the rugged conditions without complaint. Most Eastern women of his limited acquaintance would have been miserable under these circumstances, but she seemed almost to thrive on the adventure. You're staring, Mr. Evers, she said quietly as she cinched her saddle, her uncle out of earshot. Caught. He could only nod. You're not what I expected, Miss Reynolds. Lucia, she reminded him with a smile. And you're exactly what I hoped to find in the West, someone authentic, unbound by social pretense. Her words stirred something in him, a longing he had denied for so long he had almost forgotten it existed. But he pushed it firmly aside. Lucia Reynolds was returning to Philadelphia and her life of privilege. Any connection between them was temporary, a brief intersection of paths that would soon diverge again. The journey back to Pine Creek was uneventful. The avalanche had indeed changed the landscape, but Colton found an alternate route that avoided the affected area. As they rode, Edward Reynolds peppered him with questions about timber operations and transportation, making notes in a small book he carried. Lucia was quieter, her attention seemingly focused on the wilderness around them, as if committing every detail to memory. Occasionally, their eyes would meet, and Colton would feel that same unsettling warmth he'd experienced in the cabin. By mid-afternoon, they had reached the outskirts of town. As they approached the hotel, a sense of regret he hadn't anticipated settled in Colton's chest. Their adventure was over. The strange intimacy of the shared night in the cabin would fade into memory. Well, Mr. Evers, Edward Reynolds said as they dismounted, that was quite an experience. Not the Christmas I had planned, but certainly memorable. I'll have your payment ready when you come by later. Colton nodded. No hurry. I have some business at the mercantile before heading back to the ranch. Lucia handed him the reins of her borrowed horse. Thank you, Colton, she said softly, for everything. He wanted to say something meaningful, something that would acknowledge the connection he felt with her, but words had never been his strength. You're welcome, he managed, feeling wholly inadequate. As she turned to follow her uncle into the hotel, Colton found himself calling after her. Lucia. She paused, looking back at him expectantly. If you'd like, that is, if you're interested. He cleared his throat, frustrated by his own awkwardness. I could show you more of the territory before you leave. Places most visitors never see. Her smile was like the sunrise they had watched together. I would like that very much. With that, she disappeared into the hotel, leaving Colton standing in the street with 3 horses and a confusion of emotions he hadn't felt in years. The next morning, a knock at Lucia's hotel room door revealed a nervous-looking boy of about 12. Miss Reynolds? He asked, twisting his cap in his hands. Mr. Evers sent me with a message. He says if you still want to see more of the territory, he'll be waiting outside the hotel at 10 o'clock. Thank you, Lucia replied with a smile, pressing a coin into the boy's hand. Please tell Mr. Evers I'll be there. After the boy departed, Lucia turned to her wardrobe with a critical eye. The borrowed boy's clothes had been returned, but her Eastern dresses were still impractical for frontier exploration. After some deliberation, she chose her simplest walking dress and sturdiest boots, adding a warm shawl and gloves against the cold. Her uncle was engrossed in business correspondence when she informed him of her plans. With the cowboy? He asked, looking up with a frown. I'm not certain that's appropriate, Lucia. You hardly know the man. He saved our lives, Uncle Edward, she reminded him. And I want to see more of the territory while we're here. Mr. Evers knows the land better than anyone. Her uncle studied her for a moment, then sighed. Very well, but be back before dark, and remember your position. These frontier types may have different expectations than the gentleman you're accustomed to. Lucia bit back a retort. The gentlemen she was accustomed to in Philadelphia were polished and proper, but many hid calculating ambitions beneath their perfect manners. Colton Evers might be rough around the edges, but there was an honesty to him that she found far more appealing than practiced charm. At precisely 10 o'clock, she stepped outside to find Colton waiting with 2 horses. He had made some effort with his appearance, she noticed. His shirt was clean and pressed, his hair neatly combed beneath his hat, his face freshly shaven save for that light stubble that seemed to be his custom. The sight of him caused an unexpected flutter in her chest. Good morning, she said, approaching with a smile. He removed his hat briefly, a gesture that seemed almost shy. Morning. I wasn't sure you'd come. I said I would, she replied simply. He nodded, as if her keeping her word was noteworthy, then helped her mount the smaller of the 2 horses, a gentle mare with intelligent eyes. This is Daisy, he explained. She's steady on mountain trails. You'll be safe with her. As they rode out of town, Lucia was acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople. Clearly, Colton Evers escorting an Eastern lady was unusual enough to merit attention. "Where are we going?" she asked once they had left the town behind. "There's a place up in the foothills," he replied. "A hidden valley most folks don't know about. I thought you might like to see it." The day was clear and cold, the snow sparkling in the sunlight as they followed game trails through forests of pine and aspen. Colton was a different guide today, less formal, more willing to share his knowledge of the land. He pointed out animal tracks, named distant peaks, and explained how to read the weather from cloud patterns. "You love it here," Lucia observed during a brief rest to water the horses at a half-frozen stream. He looked up, surprised by her statement. "It's my home." "It's more than that," she pressed gently. "The way you talk about the land, the animals, the seasons, it's not just familiarity. It's love." Colton was quiet for a moment, running a hand along his horse's neck. "I suppose it is," he finally admitted. "Though I've never thought of it that way." "Perhaps that's why you stay, despite the hardships," she suggested. "Not just duty to your family legacy, but because this place speaks to something in you." He met her eyes then, and Lucia felt a jolt of connection. "You see too much, Lucia Reynolds. Or perhaps you're not as unreadable as you believe," she countered with a smile. They continued their journey, climbing higher into the foothills. The trail narrowed, forcing them to ride single file, but occasionally Colton would stop to point out something of interest: an eagle soaring overhead, a stand of ancient trees, a distant herd of elk moving across a snow-covered meadow. Finally, they crested a ridge, and Colton reined in his horse. "There," he said, pointing ahead. Below them lay a small valley, protected on three sides by steep slopes. A spring-fed pond, partially frozen, gleamed in the winter sunlight. Despite the season, patches of exposed ground showed grass and hardy wildflowers where the sun had melted the snow. It was like a hidden garden in the midst of the wilderness. "Oh," Lucia breathed, taking in the unexpected beauty. "It's perfect. My mother brought me here when I was a boy," Colton said, his voice softer than she had heard it before. "It was her special place. She said even in winter, you could find signs of life here." The fact that he had shared something so personal touched Lucia deeply. This wasn't just any scenic view. It was a place of memory, of connection to the mother he had lost so young. They dismounted and led the horses down a narrow path to the valley floor. Near the pond, Colton spread a blanket he had brought and unpacked a simple lunch: bread, cheese, dried fruit, and a flask of coffee. As they ate, sitting side by side on the blanket, Lucia felt a contentment she hadn't expected. There was something profoundly peaceful about this hidden place, something that made the usual social barriers seem meaningless. "Tell me about Philadelphia," Colton said suddenly. "What's your life like there?" Lucia considered the question. "Structured," she finally said. "Every day follows a pattern: morning calls, afternoon teas, evening soirees. There's a rule for everything: how to dress, what to say, whom to speak to." "Sounds confining," he observed. "It can be," she admitted. "But there are compensations. Art, music, literature. I love the libraries and museums, the theater and symphony. And there's a certain security in knowing what's expected." "But you came west," he pointed out. "Away from all that." She nodded, looking out across the valley. "I've always felt there must be more to life than social obligations and making a suitable match. When my uncle mentioned this trip, I practically begged to come along. My mother thought I was mad to want to visit uncivilized territory, as she called it." "And now that you're here," he asked, his gaze intent, "is it what you hoped for?" Lucia turned to look at him directly, struck again by how the sunlight brought out the rich blue of his eyes. "It's more," she said honestly. "The land is more beautiful, the challenge is more real, the people more." She hesitated, then finished softly, "more genuine." Something shifted in Colton's expression, a vulnerability he usually kept hidden. "You don't belong here, Lucia," he said, his voice low. "A woman like you needs the comforts of civilization." "A woman like me," she echoed, a touch of challenge in her tone. "You seem very certain about what I need, Colton Evers." "I've seen what the frontier does to people who aren't born to it," he replied. "The isolation, the hardship, it breaks something in them. They either leave or they become diminished." "Like your mother?" she guessed gently. He looked away sharply, confirming her intuition. She wasn't from here originally. My father brought her west after they married. She tried to love it, but the isolation wore her down. Lucia finished when he trailed off. Colton nodded, his expression distant. By the time she died, she'd stopped singing. That's what I remember most. She used to sing all the time when I was very young, but then one day I realized she hadn't sung in months. The simple observation held such pain that Lucia had to resist the urge to reach for his hand. I'm so sorry, Colton. That must have been terrible for you both. My father blamed himself, he continued, as if needing to speak the words now that he had begun. He became harder after she died, more focused on survival at any cost. That's when he started saying a man needs nothing but his own 2 hands and a good horse. But you brought me to her special place, Lucia said softly. You remembered where she found beauty, even in winter. Colton met her eyes again, and there was a question in his gaze that made her heart beat faster. I don't know why I brought you here. I've never brought anyone before. The admission hung between them, charged with meaning neither was ready to articulate. Lucia was acutely aware of how close they sat, of the intensity in his blue eyes, of the slight roughness of his voice. The moment was broken by the distant cry of an eagle. Both looked up to see the bird circling overhead, its wings spread wide against the blue sky. We should start back, Colton said, his tone regaining its usual practicality. Days are short this time of year. As they packed up the remains of their lunch and mounted the horses for the return journey, Lucia found herself reluctant to leave. Not just this beautiful hidden valley, but the brief connection she had felt with Colton as he shared his memories. The ride back to town was quieter, each lost in their own thoughts. As the buildings of Pine Creek came into view, silhouetted against the late afternoon sky, Lucia felt a strange sadness settle over her. When do you and your uncle plan to leave? Colton asked as they approached the hotel. The stagecoach driver is recovering well, she replied. Uncle Edward thinks we'll be able to depart the day after tomorrow. Colton nodded, his expression unreadable. Then you'll be back in Philadelphia before you know it. All this will seem like a strange dream. Not a dream, she corrected him. I won't forget, Colton. As he helped her dismount outside the hotel, their hands lingered together a moment longer than necessary. Lucia looked up at him, wishing she could find words for the confusion of emotions she felt. Thank you for today, she said simply, for sharing your mother's special place with me. He nodded, seemingly unable to speak. Then, with a tip of his hat, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving Lucia standing on the hotel steps, watching until he disappeared from sight. Inside, her uncle barely looked up from his papers as she entered their shared sitting room. How was your excursion? He asked absently. Beautiful, she replied, moving to the window to gaze out at the mountains now turning gold in the setting sun. Uncle Edward, have you ever considered what it might be like to live out here? Not just visit, but truly build a life. He looked up sharply at that. Good heavens, no? It's an interesting place to visit, and there are financial opportunities to be sure, but live here? Impossible. We're Easterners, Lucia. Our life is in Philadelphia. Of course, she murmured, though she wasn't as certain as she had been just days ago. The West had awakened something in her, a longing for a more authentic life, for connections that weren't mediated by social conventions, for the kind of quiet strength she saw in Colton Evers. But her uncle was right. Her life was in Philadelphia. In 2 days, she would board the stagecoach and leave Pine Creek behind. The thought brought an unexpected ache to her chest. That night, as she prepared for bed, Lucia found herself drawn again to the window. The moon had risen, casting silver light across the snow-covered landscape. Somewhere out there was the Circle E Ranch and Colton Evers, alone in his cabin with his books and his beliefs about survival. She pressed her palm against the cold glass, as if she could somehow reach across the distance between them. What was happening to her? How could a man she had known for only 3 days affect her so deeply? Perhaps it wasn't just the man, but what he represented, a life lived on one's own terms, shaped by the land rather than by social expectations. A life where actions mattered more than words, where survival depended on truth rather than appearances. Lucia turned from the window and climbed into bed, but sleep was long in coming. Her mind filled with images of snow-covered mountains, a hidden valley blooming despite the winter, and blue eyes that held depths of feeling beneath a carefully maintained reserve. 2 days. In 2 days, she would have to decide, return to the life she had always known, or take a risk on something entirely new. Either way, she knew with absolute certainty that she would never be quite the same again. The following day passed in a blur for Colton. He went through the motions of his usual chores at the ranch, but his mind continually strayed to Lucia. Her smile as she took in the hidden valley, the intelligent questions she asked about the land, the gentle way she had drawn out his memories of his mother. No woman had ever affected him this way, certainly not after such a brief acquaintance. It was unsettling and more than a little unwelcome. He had built his life around self-reliance, around the certainty that needing no one was the surest path to survival on the frontier. Now those beliefs felt suddenly hollow. By evening, he had made up his mind to ride back into town. He told himself it was to collect his payment from Reynolds, which he had neglected to do the previous day. But in his heart, he knew he was hoping for one more chance to see Lucia before she departed. Pine Creek was quiet as he rode in, the streets nearly empty in the early evening. A light snow had begun to fall, adding to the hush that seemed to blanket the town. As he approached the hotel, he saw a figure standing on the porch, wrapped in a heavy shawl, watching the snow. Lucia. She turned at the sound of his approach, and even in the dim light, he could see her face brighten with recognition. Something tightened in his chest at that look, a look no one had directed at him in longer than he could remember. "Colton," she said as he dismounted. "I was just thinking about you." He tied his horse to the hitching post and climbed the steps to join her on the porch. "Were you?" She nodded, a hint of shyness in her expression that was at odds with her usual directness. "I wanted to thank you again for yesterday. It meant a great deal to me." "It was just a ride," he said, though they both knew it had been more than that. "No," she replied softly. "It was a gift. You shared something precious with me, your mother's special place, your memories. I won't forget that." Colton shifted uncomfortably and used to such open appreciation. "I came to collect my payment from your uncle," he said, retreating to a safer topic. "He's meeting with the hotel owner about some business matter," Lucia replied. "But he should be back soon. Would you like to wait? I could make you some tea." The invitation was innocent enough, but something in her tone suggested deeper currents beneath the simple offer. Colton hesitated, aware that accepting meant prolonging a connection that would soon be severed anyway. The sensible thing would be to decline, to say he would return tomorrow. But when had his thoughts about Lucia Reynolds ever been sensible? Tea would be fine, he heard himself say. She led him inside to the small sitting room adjoining her bedroom. A fire burned in the grate, casting warm light across the simple furniture. Lucia busied herself with the tea things while Colton stood awkwardly by the mantel, his hat in his hands. "Please, sit," she invited, gesturing to one of the chairs by the fire. He did, feeling out of place in the civilized setting despite the room's relative modesty compared to Eastern standards. Lucia handed him a cup of tea and took the seat opposite him, her golden hair catching the firelight. "You leave tomorrow," he said, stating the obvious. She nodded, her expression solemn. "The stage departs at noon. My uncle is eager to return to Philadelphia and begin organizing his timber venture. And you? Are you eager to return?" Lucia looked into her teacup, as if seeking answers in the amber liquid. "A week ago, I would have said yes without hesitation. Now," she looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "Now I'm not certain." Colton's heart beat faster at her words, at the implication behind them. But he forced himself to remember reality. "Your life is in Philadelphia, Lucia. Your family, your future." "Perhaps," she conceded. "But what if the future I always assumed was mine isn't the one I truly want? What if there are other possibilities I never considered?" The question hung between them, fraught with meaning. Colton set his cup down, afraid his suddenly unsteady hands might betray him. "The frontier is no place for someone like you," he said, voicing the belief he had clung to since their first meeting. "It's harsh, unforgiving. It takes more than it gives." "You keep saying that," she observed, a hint of challenge in her tone. "Yet you stay? You love it here, despite the hardships. Why is it impossible to believe that someone else might feel the same way? That I might feel the same way?" "Because," he stopped, searching for words. "Because you have options I never had. You can choose comfort, security, civilization. And what if those aren't what I value most?" she pressed. "What if I've discovered that there are things more important than comfort? Things like authenticity, purpose, connection to the land. Colton stood abruptly, moving to the window to put some distance between them. The snow was falling more heavily now, each flake catching the light from the hotel windows as it passed. "You don't know what you're saying," he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "You've been here less than a week. You've seen the West at its most picturesque, snow-covered mountains, hidden valleys. You haven't experienced the blizzards that last for days, the summers so dry the land cracks beneath your feet, the isolation that can drive a person to madness." He heard her set down her cup and move to stand behind him, close enough that he could smell the subtle floral scent she wore. "You're right," she said softly. "I haven't experienced those things. But I've seen something else. I've seen a man who faces those challenges every day with courage and integrity. A man who has built a life of meaning in this harsh land, who knows its beauty as well as its dangers." Colton turned to face her, startled by her proximity and the earnestness in her expression. "What are you saying, Lucia?" "I'm saying that I've felt more alive in these few days than in all my years in Philadelphia," she replied, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in her eyes. "I'm saying that the thought of boarding that stage tomorrow and never seeing you again, never seeing these mountains again, feels like the worst kind of loss." Her words struck him like a physical blow. No one had ever spoken to him with such honesty, such emotional clarity. It terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. "You barely know me," he managed to say. "I know enough," she countered. "I know you're honorable, capable, intelligent. I know you love this land deeply, even as you acknowledge its harshness. I know there's a gentleness in you that you try to hide beneath that stoic exterior." She took a step closer, and Colton found himself unable to retreat further, trapped between her advance and the window at his back. "And I know that when you look at me," she continued, her voice softer now, "you see something that frightens you, not because it's threatening, but because it's possible." "What's possible?" he asked, barely able to form the words. "A life that includes more than mere survival," she whispered. "A life with connection, with someone who sees you for who you truly are and values that person." She was so close now that he could see the flecks of amber in her hazel eyes, the slight tremble of her lips, as she spoke words that challenged everything he had believed about his future. "Lucia," he began, not sure what he intended to say, only knowing that he had to say something to break the spell she was weaving around him. But before he could continue, the door to the sitting room opened, and Edward Reynolds entered, stopping short at the sight of them standing so close together by the window. "Mr. Evers," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I wasn't expecting you this evening." Colton stepped away from Lucia immediately, his face heating with something between embarrassment and frustration. "Mr. Reynolds, I came to collect my payment for the guide services." "Of course," Reynolds replied, moving to his desk and withdrawing an envelope. "I believe you'll find this satisfactory." As Colton took the envelope, he was acutely aware of Lucia watching him, of the conversation left unfinished between them. "Thank you," he said stiffly. "It was an experience I won't forget." "Nor will we," Reynolds assured him. "In fact, I'll be returning to Montana in the spring to oversee the start of the timber operation. Perhaps we might engage your services again at that time." "Perhaps," Colton replied, though the thought of more business with Reynolds held little appeal. His eyes sought Lucia's, trying to convey what he couldn't say aloud in her uncle's presence. She seemed to understand, for she stepped forward with a gracious smile. "Thank you for coming to say goodbye, Mr. Evers. Your guidance has been invaluable during our stay." The formality of her words was belied by the intensity of her gaze. This wasn't goodbye, her eyes seemed to say. This wasn't finished. "It was my pleasure, Miss Reynolds," he replied, matching her formal tone while trying to communicate his own unspoken message. "We'll find a way to finish this conversation." With a nod to Reynolds and a last look at Lucia, Colton took his leave, descending the hotel stairs with a confusion of emotions he had no name for. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the town in pristine white that matched the turmoil in his heart. As he mounted his horse for the ride back to the ranch, Colton knew with absolute certainty that tomorrow, when the stage departed for the east, he would be there. What he would say or do, he didn't yet know. But he couldn't let Lucia leave without some resolution to the question she had posed, the possibility of a life beyond mere survival. For the first time in years, Colton Evers found himself considering a future different from the solitary existence he had accepted as his fate. And the thought, though terrifying, was also strangely exhilarating. The morning of departure dawned clear and cold. Lucia stood at her window, watching the early light transform the snow-covered mountains from shadowy silhouettes to gleaming peaks. In a few hours, she would board the stagecoach that would take her away from Pine Creek, away from Montana territory, away from Colton Evers. Her trunk was packed, her traveling clothes laid out, everything prepared for the journey back to Philadelphia and the life she had left behind. Yet as she gazed at the wild landscape before her, Lucia felt a certainty growing in her heart. A certainty that had taken root during that first ride through the snow, blossomed in a hidden valley where wildflowers defied winter, and solidified in the unfinished conversation by this very window. She did not want to leave. Not Montana, and certainly not Colton. The realization should have frightened her. Instead, it brought a sense of clarity she had never experienced before. In Philadelphia, her path had been predetermined: marriage to a suitable man, a comfortable home, children raised according to society's expectations. It was the future her mother had planned for her, the future all young women of her class were expected to want. But standing here, looking out at a landscape both harsh and beautiful, Lucia knew she wanted something different. She wanted a life with purpose and meaning, a life connected to the land and to a man who understood its power. She wanted days filled with real work and real challenges, not social calls and endless propriety. She wanted Colton Evers, with his quiet strength and hidden depths, his blue eyes that revealed more than he knew when he looked at her. A knock at her door broke her reverie. "Lucia, are you awake? We need to finish packing if we're to make the noon stage." "Yes, Uncle Edward," she called back. "I'll be ready." But as she turned from the window, Lucia made a decision. She would be ready, not for departure, but for the most important conversation of her life. Colton rode into Pine Creek just before noon. The stagecoach was already waiting outside the hotel, the driver loading luggage while a small group of onlookers gathered to witness the departure. In a town as small as Pine Creek, the stagecoach's arrival and departure was something of an event, particularly in winter when visitors were rare. He dismounted and tied his horse to a nearby post, his eyes scanning the crowd for a glimpse of golden hair. His heart pounded uncomfortably in his chest, his mind still uncertain of what he intended to say. All night, he had wrestled with conflicting emotions, the ingrained belief that attachments were dangerous on the frontier, the fear that Lucia would come to regret staying if he asked her to, the selfish desire to keep her here despite those concerns. And beneath it all, the growing realization that his father's philosophy of isolation had been less about survival and more about fear of the pain that came with loving and losing. Finally, he spotted her, emerging from the hotel with her uncle. She was dressed for travel in a blue dress and matching coat, her golden hair partially concealed beneath a bonnet. Even from a distance, she was the most beautiful thing Colton had ever seen. As if sensing his presence, she looked up, her eyes finding his across the busy street. For a moment, they simply gazed at each other, communication passing between them without words. Then she said something to her uncle and began walking toward Colton, weaving through the crowd with purpose in every step. He met her halfway, suddenly conscious of the townsfolk watching with undisguised interest. The handsome young rancher and the beautiful Eastern lady. Their encounter was the most exciting thing to happen in Pine Creek since the last gold rush rumor. "You came," Lucia said simply when they stood face to face. "I couldn't let you leave without." Colton trailed off, still unsure of what he wanted to say. "Without what?" she prompted gently. He took a deep breath, searching for words that would convey the turmoil in his heart. "Without telling you that you've changed something in me, Lucia. Something I thought couldn't be changed." Her eyes softened, encouraging him to continue. "All my life, I believed that isolation was strength," he said, the words coming more easily now. "That needing no one was the surest path to survival. But then you rode into town on Christmas Eve, and in less than a week, you've made me question everything I thought I knew." "What do you know now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That survival alone isn't enough," he admitted. "That there might be more to life, even on the frontier, than just enduring from one season to the next." A smile began to form on her lips, a smile of such hope and joy that it took his breath away. I was going to tell you the same thing, she said, that I've made a decision. I'm not boarding that stage today, Colton. For a moment, he thought he had misheard her. What? I'm staying, she said firmly. I've spoken with my uncle. He's not happy about it, but he understands this is what I want. What I need. Colton stared at her, disbelieving. Lucia, you can't just. The frontier isn't. Isn't what? She challenged. Isn't safe? Isn't comfortable? I know that. I've seen enough to understand the challenges. But I've also seen the beauty, the freedom, the chance to build a life that means something. She took a step closer, heedless of the watching crowd. And I've seen you, Colton Evers. A man who carries the weight of his family's legacy alone because he believes that's the only way to survive. A man who remembers where wildflowers bloom in winter because his mother showed him that beauty persists even in the harshest places. Her words struck him to the core, seeing through the careful barriers he had constructed around his heart. And if you stay? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. What then? Then I find work in town, learn what I need to know about frontier life, she replied. I prove to myself, and to you, that I belong here, that I can contribute, adapt, thrive. And us? He dared to ask, the question that had tormented him through the sleepless night. Lucia's smile deepened, her eyes shining with a certainty that left no room for doubt. That depends on you, Colton. I know what I feel, what I want. But I won't pressure you into something you're not ready for. In that moment, looking at this remarkable woman who had ridden into his life on a snowy Christmas Eve and upended everything he thought he knew about himself, Colton Evers made the most important decision of his life. He reached for her hands, taking them in his own before the entire town of Pine Creek. I'm ready, he said, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart. I don't know how this works. I've spent most of my life avoiding connections, not building them. But I know that the thought of you leaving feels like losing something essential. And the thought of you staying, of building something together, feels like the first real hope I've had in years. Tears welled in Lucia's eyes, but her smile never faltered. Then that's where we'll start, with hope. Behind them, someone cleared their throat pointedly. They turned to find Edward Reynolds watching them with a mixture of resignation and concern. I see you've made your decision clear to Mr. Evers as well, he said to Lucia. I still think you're being impulsive, my dear, but I've never been able to change your mind once it's set. He turned to Colton. And you, young man, what are your intentions toward my niece? The directness of the question caught Colton off guard, but he found he had an answer ready. Honorable ones, sir. I can't offer her the comfort she's accustomed to, but I can promise to protect her, provide for her, and he glanced at Lucia, drawing strength from the trust in her eyes, and to build a life with her, if she'll have me. Reynolds studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Well, I can see there's no talking either of you out of this. The arrangements have been made. Lucia will stay at the hotel until... He hesitated, until more permanent arrangements are determined. The implication was clear, and Colton felt a rush of gratitude for the older man's grudging acceptance. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Reynolds warned. I'll be checking on her progress when I return in the spring. If I find she's unhappy or in any way mistreated, I'll personally escort her back to Philadelphia. You won't need to, Colton assured him, his eyes never leaving Lucia's face. She'll want for nothing I can provide. See that she doesn't, Reynolds replied gruffly. Then, to Lucia, the stagecoach is waiting, my dear. Time for our goodbyes. As Lucia embraced her uncle and spoke quiet words of reassurance, Colton stood back, still stunned by the turn of events. She was staying. This extraordinary woman, who had challenged his beliefs and awoken feelings he had thought long buried, was choosing to remain in Pine Creek, choosing a future that might include him. The stagecoach departed with a clatter of wheels and the crack of a whip, carrying Edward Reynolds away from Pine Creek and back toward the civilization he understood. Lucia stood beside Colton, watching until the coach disappeared around a bend in the road. Are you sure about this? He asked quietly, giving her one last chance to reconsider. She turned to him, her expression serene despite the magnitude of the choice she had just made. I've never been more certain of anything in my life, she replied. Then, with a hint of mischief in her eyes, but I'll need your help, you know. I have a great deal to learn about frontier life. Colton felt a smile, a real smile, the kind he had almost forgotten how to form, spread across his face. "I think we both have things to learn," he said, offering her his arm. "Shall we start now?" As they walked together down the main street of Pine Creek, Colton was acutely aware of the curious stares of the townsfolk, of the whispers that would surely spread like wildfire. Colton Evers, the solitary rancher who needed no one, walking arm in arm with the beautiful Eastern lady who had chosen to stay. But for the first time in years, he found he didn't care what others thought. All that mattered was the woman beside him, and the future they might build together. A future where survival was just the beginning, not the end goal. A future where his Christmas wish, one he hadn't even known he'd made, had somehow come true when she rode into town. Spring came to Montana Territory in fits and starts, with warm days followed by sudden snowstorms that reminded everyone that the frontier played by its own rules. By April, however, the snow had mostly retreated to the highest peaks, and the land around Pine Creek was transforming from white to green with astonishing speed. At the Circle E Ranch, the transformation wasn't limited to the landscape. The cabin that had stood unchanged since Colton's father's death now boasted new curtains in the windows, a carefully tended garden plot beside the porch, and a collection of wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table. Inside, Lucia moved about the kitchen with growing confidence, preparing a special dinner. Today marked 3 months since she had watched her uncle's stagecoach depart, 3 months since she had chosen to stay in Pine Creek and build a new life. Those months had been filled with both challenges and joys. She had taken a position helping the schoolteacher in town, using her Philadelphia education to instruct the older children while learning the practical skills of frontier life from the local women. The townspeople, initially skeptical of the Eastern lady who had inexplicably chosen to remain among them, had gradually accepted her determination as genuine. And Colton had undergone the most remarkable transformation of all. The solitary rancher who had once believed that needing no one was the surest path to survival had cautiously, tentatively opened himself to the possibility of partnership. They had courted properly, with Lucia remaining at the hotel while they spent their days together, riding the boundaries of the Circle E, working side by side to prepare for spring calving, talking long into the evening about their hopes for the future. 2 weeks ago, on a perfect spring morning, Colton had taken her to the hidden valley where wildflowers now carpeted the ground in a riot of color. There, with the mountains as their witness, he had asked her to be his wife. And Lucia, who had once expected to marry in Philadelphia's grandest cathedral with hundreds of guests in attendance, had found perfect joy in saying yes while standing knee-deep in wildflowers, with only the birds and the breeze to hear her acceptance. Now, as she put the finishing touches on their dinner, Lucia heard the sound of hooves approaching. Colton had been in town all day, finalizing arrangements for their wedding, which would take place in Pine Creek's small church the following Saturday. She stepped onto the porch, shading her eyes against the late afternoon sun as he rode into the yard. The sight of him still made her heart beat faster, his tall figure silhouetted against the mountains that formed the backdrop to their life together. "You look pleased with yourself," she called as he dismounted. "Good news in town." Colton grinned, an expression that had become increasingly common as winter gave way to spring. "Very good news," he replied, climbing the steps to join her on the porch. "The Reverend has everything arranged for Saturday," and he reached into his saddlebag. "This arrived on today's stage." He handed her an envelope bearing her mother's distinctive handwriting. Lucia took it with mixed emotions: hope, apprehension, relief. She had written to her parents immediately after deciding to stay in Pine Creek, explaining her choice and asking for their understanding, if not their blessing. Their responses had been predictably dismayed, but not entirely closed to the possibility that their daughter might find happiness in this unexpected place. "Shall I open it now?" she asked. Colton nodded, his expression supportive but cautious. He knew how much her parents' acceptance meant to her, even as she forged this new life far from their influence. With steady fingers, Lucia broke the seal and unfolded the letter. As she read, a smile bloomed on her face. "They're coming," she said, looking up at Colton with wonder. "For the wedding. My father has business in San Francisco, and they'll make the journey here first. They want to meet you, to see where I'll be living." Colton's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Your parents are coming to Pine Creek? Are you certain they understand what they're getting into?" Lucia laughed, the sound of pure joy echoing across the ranch yard. I doubt it. Mother still thinks I've taken leave of my senses, but she says if I'm determined to marry a Montana rancher, the least they can do is witness it in person. Well, Colton said, a hint of nervousness beneath his smile. I suppose I'll have to make a good impression on my future in-laws. Just be yourself, Lucia assured him, reaching up to touch his cheek. That's who I fell in love with, after all. He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that still took her breath away. And who might that be? He asked softly. I'm not sure I recognize myself these days. It was true. The man who had once believed that isolation was strength, that attachments were dangerous on the frontier, had gradually given way to someone who understood that true resilience came from connection, not solitude. He still worked the ranch with the same determination, still faced the challenges of frontier life with practical courage, but there was a lightness to him now, a willingness to share both burdens and joys. You're still Colton Evers, she replied. Still the man who knows this land like no one else, who keeps his word, who faces each day with quiet strength. You've just expanded, made room for more than mere survival. He smiled at that, drawing her into his arms. I had a good teacher. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Colton and Lucia stood together on the porch of what would soon be their shared home. The circle each stretched before them, cattle grazing in the greening pastures, the barn and outbuildings solid against the backdrop of wilderness. It was not an easy life they had chosen. The frontier would continue to present challenges, harsh winters, drought summers, the 1,000 natural calamities that tested those who dared to build a life in this untamed land. But they would face those challenges together, drawing strength from each other and from the community that had gradually accepted them as a unit, the solitary rancher and the Eastern lady who had defied expectations to find love on the frontier. Do you ever regret it? Colton asked softly, his arms still around her as they watched the sunset. Stay. Lucia turned in his embrace, looking up at the man who had captured her heart that snowy Christmas when she had ridden into town. Never, she replied with absolute conviction. This is where I belong. With you, with this land, with the life we're building together. As their lips met in a kiss that held both promise and fulfillment, Lucia Reynolds, soon to be Lucia Evers, knew with unshakable certainty that she had made the right choice. She had found her true home, not in Philadelphia's elegant drawing rooms, but here on the Montana frontier, with a man who had learned that love was not a weakness but the greatest strength of all. And as the first star appeared in the darkening sky, Colton held close the woman who had changed everything, who had ridden into town on a snowy Christmas Eve and shown him that a life built on